So Dr. Wallenfang is one of my professors, former professors, when I was getting my graduate degree in theology, and we've spent plenty of hours sitting down in the classroom and in his office talking about life and culture and theology. And so he had come out to Wisconsin to visit some friends where I'm at now, and he wanted to come up and visit me. And I thought, well, let's put our heads together and see if we can do a video talking about culture or something going on. So a few weeks ago, I was sort of scouring the internet to see what was going on in the music scene, and I should probably consult my siblings because they're more adept and aware of what's going on in the popular culture than I am. But anyways, I came across Ariana Grande's new song, God is a Woman. I thought, oh, no, this is interesting. And I watched the music video, which is it's a piece of art in and of itself. Very fascinating and certainly provocative. And I thought, I think that Christians need to be in this space analyzing, describing, critiquing, and showing what's of positive value in her song and the message that she's trying to portray. So Donnie and I are going to talk about that right now. So Donnie, I had you listen to the song as you were driving over here. What were some of your initial reactions to hearing the song and not really having much of a background to go off of? What were some of your initial thoughts?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking, Zach, and for this invitation to really explore this song further. I study phenomenology, and one thing we try to do in phenomenology is to bracket judgment before going into an experience, to give it a fair shake and to describe it in truth and everything that it gives in terms of meaning, what I perceive and what I interpret in the song. So the song called God is a Woman, obviously the title already quite provocative within a Judeo-Christian context, at least, in which we tend to think of God through masculine images almost exclusively. God the Father, God the Son. Oftentimes we even say God the Holy Spirit and use masculine pronouns, he, him, his, to talk about any of the three persons of the Trinity, who is God. Yet for Catholic teaching, we understand that God transcends sexual difference by definition. As it says in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, God is pure spirit, in whom there's no room for difference between sexual forms and things like that. Nevertheless, we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, that God creates human beings precisely as male and female, and so precisely as male and female in our sexual complementarity and diversity, but a diverse complementarity, we image God fully. So in listening to the song, I try to bracket everything and just tune in to see what's the message. Take it in. So I have to say, I enjoyed this song, and what I enjoyed most about this song, as many in popular culture, is the real honesty and sincerity in describing erotic phenomena. And the word erotic comes from a Greek word eros, and eros is one of the Greek words for love. And the ancient Greek philosopher Plato talked about eros as a really good thing, in as much as what we yearn for, what we long for, everything we desire, we can describe in terms of goodness, truth, and beauty. And this is what I hear in this song, Ariana singing about this erotic desire, talking about her one, who she calls boy, or other things in the song, her beloved, about this very sexual rendezvous, going past midnight and everything else. It's a natural human longing for intimacy, for communion, and affirmation, belonging, and to be loved, and to be able to love another person. So phenomenology certainly picks up on this right away. And in so many ways doesn't see it as much different than so many other songs on the contemporary playlist.
Yeah. So you were talking a little bit about erotic desire, the sexual nature. How would anyone, especially if they're just they don't want anything to do with religion, how would anyone come to see that their sexual desire might have a divine element contained in it? Because isn't that what you're sort of describing, what the Greeks understood as eros?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think desire wells up in us as human beings almost like a question. And whenever we ask a question, it presupposes an answer precedes it. And so when we have a desire, when we have a yearning, it means the goal of the yearning already is there. It's already present. It simply has to be discovered. The question is, do we want to discover it in full or just in part? And this is where we find a lot of different possibilities within the realm of human experience. And I think what's sad to me about the song, about its lyrics, is that it seems to have this yearning for some kind of goal of desire that could withstand the weight of the desire itself. And yet it ends up being a desire frustrated in as much as it devolves into some kind of lustful encounter. And I think a real important distinction needs to be made between lust and love, like the fullness of love, which would include the fullness of goodness, of truth,
Yeah.
and of beauty. And so in the song, the encounter, what kind of relationship is this? Is it a transient one? What's the level of commitment? And there again is the difference between some kind of cheap one-night stand kind of encounter, a kind of hookup event, or a lifelong marriage. There's definitely a difference, and in phenomenology we would describe each and show like what's incredibly different about each. If we're talking about the context of marriage and I'm here for you and I'm responsible for you and I love you as much as possible unconditionally, now that's a powerful love that is much of higher worth than any kind of conditional love or any kind of love which is really lust that's only concerned about the stimulation, the thrill of it, which in effect you're using another person just to get this stimulus.
How do you think, so someone's maybe caught up in this lifestyle, it's hard not to, because it's almost as present as the air that we breathe now. I'm just curious, how would anyone see that there's something more than just a transient hookup and encounter for the pure reason of either pleasure or a power move, which I think is part of the undermining quality of the song, especially if you watch the music video. There's a scene where Ariana has the words power written on her arm, and there's definitely a very feminist overtone to her critique. How do you see beyond this sort of rancor of people just infighting about gender and stuff? How does someone break out of that?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and I think it comes down to being careful not to confuse the ultimate goal of our desire, the fullness of goodness, truth, and beauty, with just some kind of parts or some kind of confused means to a lesser end. And so I think when we really contemplate who we are as human beings, why we're here, what's our highest possibility as human beings, who is the hero? For example, the hero is not the man or woman who just is looking out for their own interests, who's just trying to get a quick fix. The hero is the one that ultimately lays down their life for the other to save them, giving all they have without remainder. This is the hero, and this is what is possible for each and every one of us human beings, no matter where we're at in life, no matter what we're doing. And so pleasure has a logic. Pleasure for pleasure's sake ends in destruction. It's a very ironic thing. It's a very paradoxical thing, because oftentimes we think that pleasure promises this ultimate liberation, and the more pleasure I can get, the more free I am, the more divine I am, or something like this. But in fact, pleasure has its place, but in a much bigger picture. So if we pursue pleasure for its own sake, then we will go down the path of alcohol and drugs and pornography.
Any sort of idol, really.
Yes, any kind of idol, and we can end up in addiction. Not that we want to, but here we are. But the beautiful thing about the possibility of the hero is that even in these situations, there is a way out through this courageous resistance to being a slave to the pleasure for pleasure's sake. So
maybe if I could understand it, if we look at this from a frame of erotic desire, like you talk about, which is, I think, is incredibly sexualized now, but the Greeks understood it in a broader sense, that perhaps if you open yourself up to just that being your only form of desire, and it's passion, but if you let it go wild, then it's going to consume you. Is that sort of what you're trying to get at?
Yeah. I think that erotic desire in the sexual form, in 1 John in the New Testament calls the lust of the flesh, but related to this stuff like gluttony and drunkenness and anything of the flesh that might stimulate for its own sake, it can be quite destructive, because if we think about the greatest goal of our bodies, of our sexuality, it's self-evident to become mother and father. This is the greatest thing. And as the Catholic Church teaches, the child is the crowning fruit of marriage. And any vision of sexuality that lacks that holistic understanding of becoming mother and father, of becoming responsible for your husband or wife, first of all, and then becoming responsible for your sons and daughters, is missing the mark in some way. And a lot of times it's reinforced by a kind of contraceptive mentality concerning sexuality, as if it's not about conceiving a child. But according to nature, it certainly is. It's entirely obvious how male and female go together for us human beings, where we all come from, something from man, something from woman. And so if we lose that orientation to the whole meaning of our sexuality, we end up in some very dehumanizing places.
So in the course of our conversation, I was just reflecting on, as Dr. Wallenfang talked about Mary, the mother of Jesus, just how tough she was as a human being, and sort of reflecting on the cultural circumstances in which she was living in that provided a great amount of risk of her saying yes to God. In Luke chapter 1, it describes angel Gabriel presenting to the Blessed Virgin that, hey, you're going to be a mother, and I want you to be the mother of God's Son, Jesus. And, she's sort of taken back and confused. And she asks this question, but how can this be? And I think that, I like to consult Dr. Wallenfang, but this presents a fundamental truth about Catholic theology, that we like questions, and that it's okay to seek deeper insight, and that we don't accept superstition. We want evidence and rationale and intelligence. She's asking an intelligent question. So I think that's a very sort of a pro to a feminist type of approach, perhaps.
Yeah, I think every feminism worthy of the name involves some kind of critique about a disorder, how the order has gone wrong. And so every feminist critique will unmask and expose and try to deconstruct any oppressive power structures, which tend to be, male domination. But this is the thing ironic, going back to the Ariana Grande song, God as a Woman, where it only accentuates all the more this eros become lust. And that's been the problem throughout human history. Why does man dominate woman? Out of lust, out of treating her as an object. So woman gains no greater power or dignity simply by reinforcing this abuse that's been going on all along, and being treated as an object, or then in turn treating man as an object, or manipulating him for whatever lesser than human ends and stuff like that. But the good yearning in every authentic feminism that would recuperate the dignity of woman and the feminine genius, always in relation to motherhood, just as a great masculine project, is always in reference to fatherhood, this fullness of vocation, where whether single or married, whatever state of life is, as you are furthered into maturity, that you become more and more responsible for the other person who faces you. This is the essential meaning of motherhood and fatherhood in their respective forms and their complementarity. So Mary, as you bring up this good point about how she's questioning this divine summons that you will conceive and bear a child, but she says, how can this be? I have not known a man. I haven't had sexual relations. I'm betrothed to Joseph, but we haven't consummated our marriage. How could I be with child? And so yes, every great theology, again, a holistic theology, which isn't just a contextual theology, whether feminist or liberation of somewhere or otherwise, but a holistic theology which will involve all these elements. Yes, feminist theology, liberation theology, whatever kind of contextual theology, will involve a critical questioning of the faith. What do we believe and why? Not as a kind of suspicious sort of approach where I'm not so sure about this. Oh, it's obviously coming out of patriarchy and male hegemony and misogyny, obviously, like, something like this. But it's nevertheless calling into question, why do we teach this, and what's behind it, and how is it rational? How does it make sense? How does it relate with natural science and the best of all forms of knowledge in an interdisciplinary way? And I think this is something so beautiful about Catholic teaching and Catholic faith, is it's always this integral relationship between faith in God's revelation that transcends the capacities of reason on one hand, so divine revelation on one hand, and on the other, reason itself, what we can know through natural law, through the natural order, through the best of natural sciences, and that these work together. They're certainly integrated into the fullness of knowledge, or what in Latin we call scientia, or in English, science. So theology is a science, just like biology, chemistry, physics. And when the university began in medieval times, theology was considered the queen of all sciences, because these are the deepest questions we ask. And again, if we ask the question, it presupposes an answer precedes the question and provokes the question. And so this is what we do in theology. All the sciences are very much integrated, theology included. So I think Mary is a great example in the theologian, in the contemplative, in simply asking why, asking how. And this is what we do in theology. We ask these kinds of questions in a very interdisciplinary way.
So if we could say to Mary, "You go, girl," that would be correct.
Exactly, I would say so. Yeah, she's definitely a trendsetter in this regard, a real model
An innovator
theologian.
of sorts.
Oh, for sure.
So during my master's courses, actually the first course with Dr. Wallenfang, we studied a book called She Who Is by Elizabeth Johnson. She's a feminist theologian. And what I drew from this book and studying is she makes a point that if God is infinite, if God is purely spiritual and immaterial, then we can't really contain God within human categories at all. And so she critiques the typical masculine approach to looking at God and says, well, why can't you then say that God could be a woman? And under her framework, that's a valid point. And we actually see different feminine images of God in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. So I wanted to consult Dr. Wallenfang to see, could you blow up into a broader sense my introduction to why Ariana Grande, if she wants to look at God as a woman, she has a point there, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think theologian Elizabeth Johnson makes a huge contribution to the Christian theological tradition in this recuperation of the feminine genius in reference to God. So again, back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, if the imago Dei, or being created in God's image and likeness, is essentially to be created as male and female, that female is just as much valid and valuable as thinking God in terms of an image as male. So we need to take into account both sexual forms and the anthropological outlook in order to get the fullness of this imago Dei concept in Christianity. And the beautiful thing about the heart of the gospel of Christianity is that God becomes human in Jesus of Nazareth, the man, yet through woman, named Mary of Nazareth. So masculinity and femininity have an equal role to play in the revelation of God and concerning our redemption. God becomes human as Jesus the man, expressing this masculine genius of initiation of gift, as St. John Paul II will talk about in his theology of the body, yet through woman, Mary of Nazareth, who embodies the feminine genius of active receptivity to gift, not merely a passive passivity, but a very active one in which she has full agency in her free response to God and her fiat, let it be done unto me according to your word. So both of these concepts work together, but even before the revelation of God in Christ in the Old Testament, a passage like the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 66, verse 13, we read here, like the voice of the Lord speaking, "As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you. In Jerusalem you shall find your comfort." And two other places in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 1 and chapter 49, verse 13, use this imagery of God comforting her people, essentially. And several saints and mystics and theologians throughout the centuries, such as Julian of Norwich, such as Anselm of Canterbury, use feminine language in prayers to God and things. So there certainly is a place for this within the theological tradition, within the theological imagination. And it's I heard it said once, one of my professors at Loyola University Chicago, Dr. Pauline Viviano, said once in class that God created us and then we return the favor, meaning that the images and language and concepts we use for God, yes, are very anthropocentric, or coming out of our own experience as human beings. We could do no other in referencing God. And yet what's most interesting about this God revealed in Jesus is a God who has something to say to us, something to reveal to us, and it involves the equality of the sexes, male and female, equal in dignity, equal in value, a real unified anthropology, yet precisely unified in as much as it's diverse, that there's no genuine unity without genuine diversity to unite. Mm-hmm. And this is what's meant by complementarity between male and female, how they go together. Mm-hmm. How me, as a male, I don't make sense simply as a male, but I'm only in reference to female, and vice versa. A female's only in reference with her body, with her psychology, with their personality, in reference to male. And any kind of derivation from these stable identities of masculine and feminine is because of the stable identities to begin with. And so this is a kind of a holistic anthropology, and there's plenty good room within the tradition to imagine God and to approach God in feminine terms. But it has a place, and when we're using sexual metaphors to talk about God, we have to be careful not just to mix and match them in certain contexts, like liturgical contexts, for example, where one of the primary metaphors is Christ the bridegroom, the man, and the church the bride, the feminine form, who is personified above all in Mary. And so, just as God is revealed in Jesus the man, in this masculine genius initiation of gift, that God could take on flesh only in and through a woman, only in and through her and her yes to God and her womb. And so there's a beautiful complementarity at work here, and I think Elizabeth Johnson does so much to just bring further and force the feminine genius within Christian theology today.